one knows what one knows, and more practical or existential questions of what it might mean to lead a good or fulfilled human life. Much mainstream philosophy has given up on the task of trying to integrate knowledge and wisdom into a single synoptic vision. I will try to show how much of the appeal of Continental philosophy lies in its attempt to bridge or reduce this gap between knowledge and wisdom, or theory and practice, thereby retaining something of an echo of the ancient definition of philosophy as the love of wisdom. But, as we shall see, in a world which is increasingly modeled on the procedures of the natural sciences, such a view is not without problems of its own. The next few chapters can be divided in line with another classical philosophical distinction, the historical and the systematic. Chapter 2 sketches different historical ways of making the distinction between Continental and analytic philosophy. I trace Continental philosophy to the reception of the work of Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, who in many ways is the final great figure common to both Continental and analytic traditions, and also announces the parting of their ways. I shall examine why this is the case by contrasting different approaches to Kant. I shall also look in some detail at the debates which Kant's work inspired in the 1780s and 1790s, and then show how these debates established the key issue for German idealism in the work of J.G. Fichte and G.W.F. Hegel. Crudely stated, that issue is, does Kant's critique of reason end up, completely against its express intention, undermining the basis for moral and religious belief? That is, doesn't the critique of reason, which has to be the critique of all belief, end up in a nightmare of total skepticism and nihilism? We shall follow out the considerable implications of that thought in 19th and 20th century Continental philosophy. Chapter 3 begins by considering some problems with the distinction between Continental and analytic philosophy, before looking at some rather stereotypical, indeed amusing, representations of it in the literature. I then discuss two meanings of Continental philosophy, as a professional self-description used by philosophers, and as a cultural feature with a particular history used by many more people, Margaret Thatcher included. I argue that much of the hostility and misunderstanding of Continental philosophy by analytic philosophers consists in the fact that these two meanings are unhelpfully enmeshed, and that the professional self-description comes to overlay the cultural feature in often harmful ways. I then look at the history and cultural context for Continental philosophy in the English-speaking world, advancing the thesis that the conflict between philosophical traditions is best understood in terms of C.P. Snow's famous model of the two cultures, namely, that cultural life in the English-speaking world is marked by a divide between science on the one hand and literature or humane understanding on the other. That is to say, Continental philosophy is not so much something foreign that takes place over there, but is rather the expression of an antagonism at the heart of something like Englishness. I focus on the instructive historical example of John Stuart Mill in this regard, and his key reflections on the English cultural divide between empiricist and speculative habits of thought, which plays out in the antagonism between the romanticism of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham. In conclusion, I turn to other, more recent expressions of the conflict between the two cultures. In Chapter 4, I try to lay out what is distinctive and compelling about Continental philosophy in a more systematic manner. After making some remarks on how one may account for the difference of practice amongst philosophers, I focus on the notions of tradition and history, and show how these terms are interestingly understood in two philosophers, Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. I propose a model for describing philosophical practice in the Continental tradition, organized around three key terms: critique, praxis, and emancipation. This aims to show how and why much Continental philosophy is